Papira pu 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 pu. A, jeszcze muszę coś puścić w tle. Dżorski. Dun, dun. Pozdro. Wtedy chciałem sobie coś puścić. La 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 lila. Okej, co ja tu chcę zrobić? Bastard von Asgard. Co by sobie tu puścić? Real time history. Fucking. Real time. Kurwa, nie mają playlist. Ja nie mogę, co za ludzie. A Jezu. A start from Asgard. A to sobie puścimy. Epic history. Epic fucking history. Sharing picture. Stalingrad. Bastard from Asgard. Oh.
Meanwhile, the British and French send warships to the Dardanelles to threaten Constantinople, capital of the Turkish Ottoman Empire. They believe a show of force will quickly cause Turkey to surrender. They bombard Turkish shore forts in the narrow straits, but 3 battleships are sunk by mines and 3 more damaged. The attack is called off.
Bastard from a deadlock.
On the Western Front, the British attack at Neuve-Chapelle. But the advance is soon halted by German barbed wire and machine guns. British and Indian units suffer 11,000 casualties, about a quarter of the attacking force. 6 weeks later, at the Second Battle of Ypres, the Germans attack with poison gas for the first time on the Western Front. A cloud of lethal chlorine forces Allied troops to abandon their trenches. But the Germans don't have enough reserves ready to exploit the advantage. Soldiers on both sides are quickly supplied with crude gas masks.
Nie wiem co się dzieje, a czemu po tym dodatku się tak jakoś wolno wszystko wczytuje. Może to też wina tego moda, nie? Road to 56. To są wielki ta. Ja wiedziałem co se puścić, mówię, a to se puścimy. But they immediately meet fierce Turkish resistance and are pinned down close to the shore. The day before the landings, the Ottoman Empire. Jeszcze bym tego, bo teraz Wiktoria dostała DLC, bym sobie obczaił to. Że to tak 100 zł kosztuje, to a wypłata dopiero w następnym tygodniu. Jeszcze Europkę by można ociupać tego typu. In all, more than 1 million Armenians perish. The Allies condemn the events as a crime against humanity and civilization and promise to hold the perpetrators criminally responsible. To this day, the Turkish government disputes the death toll and that these events constituted a genocide. On the Eastern Front, a joint German-Austro-Hungarian offensive in Galicia breaks through Russian defenses, recapturing Przemysl and taking 100,000 prisoners. It is the beginning of a steady advance against Russian forces. At sea, the British passenger liner Lusitania, sailing from New York to Liverpool, is torpedoed by a German U-boat off the coast of Ireland without warning. 1,188 passengers and crew perish, including 128 Americans. US President Woodrow Wilson and the American public are outraged. But Germany insists the liner was a fair target, as the British used her to carry military supplies. In May, the Allies launched the Second Battle of Artois in another effort to break through the German lines. A ludzie chwalą, tylko jest taki problem z tym DLC, że widziałem jeden komentarz, że 2-3 DLC dostaniemy Wiktorię 2. A to oni też takie cwaniaki są, żeby no po prostu kasę ciągnąć, nie? Bo oni jako no jako firma, jako przedsiębiorstwo, no muszą zarabiać, nie? Muszą jakoś napędzać tą swoją machinę. Już dużo było tak, że dużo było wypadków, że wiesz, wydawali fajną grę, w pełni taką zrealizowaną i studia upadały, nie? Bo praktycznie ludzie to kupili i się przestali tym interesować. Tak było przecież z tym Original Warem. Naval Bomber. The Italian army makes its first assault against Austro-Hungarian positions along the Isonzo River, but is repulsed with heavy losses. Meanwhile, the Allies face a crisis on the Eastern Front. The Russians have begun a general retreat, abandoning Poland. German troops enter Warsaw. I tu jest więcej coś. Megas 111. Dziesiątkę jakąś ogarnąć. Mogę tam? O, w Leningradzie. as he
I tak
becomes
powinna
more and
Polska
more
wyglądać,
closely
no
tied
dokładnie.
to Russian military defeat. At Gallipoli, the
Teraz myślę
Allies land
zaatakować tych
reinforcements at Suvla Bay,
Austriaków.
but neither they nor a series of fresh attacks by the Anzacs can break the
Ja bym
deadlock.
musiał mieć
Conditions for both sides are
lotniska
terrible.
porobione, to
Troops are
jest 2
tormented
miesiące.
not only by the enemy, but by heat, flies,
No i się
and
zrzucę tymi
sickness.
spadochroniarzami, nie?
In the Atlantic, a German U-boat sinks the liner SS Arabic. 44 are lost,
5 Litwę.
including 3 Americans.
Ale tam
In
mniejsza.
response to further US warnings, Germany ends all attacks on passenger ships. On the Western Front, the Allies mount their biggest offensive of the war so far, designed to smash through the front and take pressure off their beleaguered Russian ally. The French attack in the Third Battle of Artois and Second Battle of Champagne. The British, with the help of poison gas, attack at Loos.
Poison.
Despite initial gains, the attacks soon get bogged down, with enormous losses on all sides. Allied troops land at Salonika in Greece to open a new front against the Central Powers and bring aid to Serbia.
New front.
But the Allies
New
are too
beginning.
late. Bulgaria joins the Central Powers.
Korowałem odzyskane
And their
tereny?
joint
Tak.
offensive overruns Serbia in 2 months. That winter, the remnants of the
O, te niech
Serbian
zostaną
army escape
jakie
through the
są.
Albanian mountains. Their losses are horrific. War, a third of Serbia's army
Teraz
has
sobie
been
można
killed,
zrobić
the highest proportion of
State
any
of
nation.
Japan. Oni mają wojnę domową, tak?
Fierce fighting continues on the Italian front, as Italian troops launch the third and fourth battles
volunteers.
of the Isonzo. Austro-Hungarian forces, though outnumbered, are dug in on the high ground and impossible to dislodge. In the Middle East, a British advance on Baghdad is blocked by Turkish forces at the Battle of Ctesiphon, 25 miles south of the city. The British withdraw to Kut, where they are besieged.
Tetsuki
The
Katayama.
Allies abandon the Gallipoli campaign. 83,000 troops are secretly evacuated without alerting Turkish forces. Not a man is lost.
Ja bym tu jeszcze zrobił.
It's one of the best executed
Okay.
plans of the war. The campaign has cost both sides 250,000 casualties. 1915 is a bad year for the Allies. Enormous losses for no tangible gains. But there is no talk of peace. Instead, all sides prepare for even bigger offensives in 1916, with new tactics developed from earlier failures. All sides still believe a decisive battlefield victory is within grasp. World War I was supposed to have been a short and glorious war. But by 1916, a new kind of industrialized warfare had seen the death
Matrioszka.
toll soar into the millions, with no end in sight. Naval blockades were beginning to cause shortages of food and fuel across Europe, while thousands of women had entered the workforce.
W ogóle ci agenci to się tylko sprowadzają do tego, żeby robić rządy kolaboracyjne.
Sides were preparing for a long war.
I tyle. Właściwie.
The war has raged for a year and a half as the Allies continue to battle the Central Powers, recently joined by Bulgaria.
Pozdro.
At sea, the British maintain their naval blockade of Germany, preventing the import of food and other vital raw materials. Germany has retaliated with a U-boat blockade of Britain, but has to limit its attacks to avoid provoking the neutral USA, whose citizens have already been caught in the crossfire. On the Western Front, French, British and Belgian troops are dug in opposite the Germans, both sides trapped in the bloody stalemate of trench warfare. On the Eastern Front,
Ziemie, które posiadają Czechy nasze, masz je, czy oddałeś Czechosłowacji?
But their army has suffered huge
Nie wiem, o co ci
losses.
chodzi.
On the Italian front, Italian troops have launched a series of costly, unsuccessful attacks against strong Austro-Hungarian defences. While on the Balkan front, the Central Powers have overrun Serbia, whose army is forced to make a bitter retreat through the Albanian mountains. Now, on the 5th of January, Austro-Hungarian troops attack Montenegro.
Full drum
They
oczywiście.
are delayed at the Battle of Mojkovac, but 3 weeks later, Montenegro is forced to surrender. On the Caucasus front, the Russians launch a surprise winter offensive against Ottoman Turkish forces. 6 weeks later, Russian troops occupy the city of Erzurum. In April, they capture the Black Sea port of Trebizond. Meanwhile, the British transport 2 motorboats to Lake Tanganyika in Africa. They finally arrive after a
Lepszy defense ma.
10,000-mile trip by sea and land, and help the British seize control of the
A
strategic
to nie jest do
base
defensu,
from
więc
local German
szczerze
forces.
powiedziawszy to jest lepsze.
The same month, in
Armor
German
skirts.
Cameroon, German troops besieged on Mora Mountain for 18 months finally surrender to
Breakthrough
the
armor, no.
Allies. It marks the end of the Cameroon campaign.
Chodzi mi o to, że gdy Niemcy zajmą Czechosłowację, to my też coś dostajemy, czy masz te ziemię zajęte? Tak, mam, tak. Ładnie, mam
On the
wszystko.
Western Front, the Germans unleash a devastating assault on the French fortress town of Verdun. German General Erich von Falkenhayn knows France will defend this symbolic town to the last man. His plan, in his own words, is to bleed France white in its defense. It is the strategy of attrition. Verdun becomes one of the most terrifying battles of the war. A mincing machine, where infantry divisions are destroyed almost as fast as they can be fed into the line. In Britain, 1 million men have already volunteered for military service. But the government realizes it won't be enough. Britain becomes the last major power to introduce conscription.
Husarz.
That spring, on the Western Front, British troops are the last to be issued with steel helmets.
Husarz.
The nature of trench warfare produces a high proportion of head wounds. The German Stahlhelm, the French Adrian helmet, and the British Mark I steel helmet offer limited protection from shell splinters and shrapnel. Neutral Portugal has been cooperating with the British, which seems to offer the best chance of holding on to her African colony, Portuguese Angola. On the 9th of March, Germany
Pozdro.
retaliates by declaring war on Portugal. On the Eastern Front, Russia launches an attack near Lake Narok to relieve pressure on the French
Being
in Verdun,
stockpiled.
but it's a disaster. There are 100,000 Russian casualties, and the attack fails to divert any German troops from the fighting at Verdun. In Dublin, Irish Republicans launch an armed revolt against
Kupujesz
British
jakieś
rule.
zasoby, na swoich
It
działamy.
becomes known as the Easter Rising and is put down after 6 days of street fighting.
Aluminium. Mi potrzebne tam aluminium?
In the Middle East, after a 5-month siege, British forces at Kut surrender. General Townsend leads 9,000 British and Indian soldiers into captivity. About half later die from starvation or disease. Britain wants Arab support in its fight against the Ottoman Empire. so it's promised Arab leaders an independent Arab state after the war. But now, Britain and France secretly signed the Sykes-Picot Agreement, planning after the war to divide the Middle East into British and French zones of control. Unaware of this
Bastard
deal,
from
Hussein
Asgard.
bin Ali, Sharif of Mecca, leads the Arabs in revolt against Turkish Ottoman rule. In the Battle of Mecca, his forces seize control of the Holy City. On the Italian front, Austro-Hungarian forces launch a surprise attack at Asiago. Italian defences give way. Austro-Hungarian troops are poised to break through into northern Italy.
Jeszcze 2 miesiące musimy
That
czekać.
month in the North Sea, the German High Seas Fleet clashes with the British Grand Fleet at the Battle of Jutland. In the only major naval battle of the war, the British suffer heavier losses, but claim victory as the German fleet withdraws and does not re-emerge from its base for the rest of the war. For the summer of 1916, the Allies have planned major simultaneous offensives against the Central Powers, from east and west.
Plan W.
Now they are needed more than ever to relieve pressure on the French at Verdun and the Italians at Asiago. The Russians launch their attack first. On the Eastern Front, General Alexei Brusilov has carefully maintained the element of surprise. His troops break through the enemy lines, in some places advancing 60 miles, and taking 200,000 prisoners. This brilliant, though costly, Russian attack achieves its aim, as the Central Powers are forced to redeploy troops from other fronts to shore up the line.
Bombowce. Riyad.
HMS Hampshire, en
Riyad.
route to Russia, hits a mine and sinks off Orkney. Among the 650 dead is Britain's iconic Secretary of State for War, Lord Kitchener.
Kurwa, jak ja się cieszę już, że będzie koniec studiów. Ja pierdolę.
Italian troop ship Principe
Prawda.
Umberto is sunk by a German submarine. It's the deadliest sinking of the
Bastard
war,
from Asgard.
with 1,900 lives lost. On the Western Front, Britain and France launch their major summer offensive, the Battle of the Somme.
Matyjasz.
Hopes are high for a breakthrough, but the first day is a disaster.
No, Austrię,
Strong Allied
Jugosławię trzeba
artillery
będzie ścisnąć.
fails to knock out German defenses, and waves of British infantry are cut down by machine
Będzie
guns
pozdro.
as they advance into no man's land. In the space of a few hours, the British suffer 57,000 casualties, a third of them killed. It's the worst day in the history of the British Army. But more
Suleiman.
attacks are ordered, and the battle will rage for another 5 months. Encouraged by the Russian advance, Romania joins the Allies. But despite
British
an initially
Raj.
successful advance into Transylvania, Romania quickly faces a counter-offensive from German, Bulgarian and Austro-Hungarian forces. The Allied force at Salonika tries to support Romania by launching their own offensive towards Monastir. With Serbian troops in the lead, there are small gains, but dogged Bulgarian resistance prevents a breakthrough. On the Western Front, General von Falkenhayn finally calls off the attack at Verdun. The French army has honored their commander, General Nivelle's promise. Ils ne passeront pas. They shall not pass. But victory comes at a terrible price.
Terrible
365,000 casualties. The
price.
Germans lose almost as many. Verdun remains one of the bloodiest battles in human
No i w
history.
końcu robią jakieś zajebiste oddziały.
For his
8,
defeat at
7.
Verdun, Falkenhayn is sacked,
O.
and Germany's heroes
Jakoś myślą, a nie kurde.
Hindenburg
Oni mają 800 dywizji i to w początku gry, no to kurwa mać.
Meanwhile, Battle of the Somme continues.
Ludzie.
Near the village of Flers, the British introduce a new weapon they hope will break the deadlock of the trenches. It is called the tank. But despite some small successes, the first tanks are too few in number and too prone to mechanical failure to make any real impact.
Bastard po
On the Eastern
Masgard.
Front, Russia's Brusilov
from
offensive
Asgard.
comes to an end. Casualty estimates vary wildly, but it's clear both sides have suffered catastrophic losses. Neither the Russian nor the Austro-Hungarian army ever fully recovers. On the Italian front, heavy fighting rages throughout the autumn, as Italian forces make repeated, costly assaults against Austro-Hungarian positions along the Isonzo River. The Battle of the Somme comes to an end amid autumn rain and mud. The Allies have advanced
Zbiórka.
at the cost of 600,000 casualties. German losses are about 450,000. The Allies reassure themselves that this is a winning strategy, because at this rate, Germany will run out of men first. Meanwhile, disaster engulfs Romania, as the country is overrun by the Central Powers. Romanian forces suffer 250,000 casualties. The remnants of its army take position alongside the Russians on the Eastern Front. That winter, Franz Joseph, Emperor of Austria since 1848, dies. He is succeeded by Karl. In Britain, Prime Minister Herbert Asquith is forced from office and succeeded by David Lloyd George, while General Joffre is replaced as French Commander-in-Chief by General Nivelle, who promises victory through
Milion
bold,
bałek.
aggressive action.
Można wyjebać.
Amid the comings and
Pozdro.
goings, US President Woodrow Wilson's attempts to mediate a peace settlement come
20.
to nothing. Neither side is willing to make concessions. In 1960,
Another subject.
World War I became a war of attrition.
Dobra, to ja robię dzikie może i zrzuty tutaj. Linz, Salzburg.
And inflicting such enormous losses, they would be forced to surrender. In 1917, the strategy will push Europe's major powers to the brink of collapse. Germany knows it will lose a long war of attrition against the Allies, who have greater resources. So its leaders gamble. They resume unrestricted submarine warfare, believing that U-boats can cut off Britain's food imports by sea and starve the country into surrender within 6 months. But the new shoot-on-sight tactics mean neutral American ships will inevitably be caught in the crossfire, risking America joining the war on the Allied side. Just 2 days into the campaign, the SS Housatonic, an American steamer carrying wheat from Galveston, Texas to England, is sunk by a U-boat. The British then pass to the US government a telegram they've intercepted from German Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmermann to the German ambassador in Mexico.
Mexico?
Germany is encouraging Mexico to attack America if America and Germany end up at war. The so-called Zimmermann telegram puts yet more pressure on US President Wilson to declare war on Germany. In Russia, enormous casualties and bread shortages lead to riots and revolution. The Tsar abdicates. A provisional government takes charge, pledging to continue the war. But at the front, Russian troops begin to desert en
Not in
masse.
position.
After a string of German provocations, the US finally declares war on Germany. It brings immense resources to the Allied cause, but they will take many months to mobilize. And the German gamble of unrestricted submarine warfare may still pay off. April is the U-boats' most successful month of the war. They sink 886,000 tons of Allied shipping, an average of 17 ships a day, all packed with urgently needed food and
Połowę
supplies.
żeśmy im... Okej.
Britain will face starvation if the U-boats are not defeated soon. On the Western Front, the British launched the Battle of Arras, a diversion to support a major upcoming French
Czy
offensive.
Wienna trzeba? Wienna.
After heavy fighting, Canadian troops seized the high ground of Vimy Ridge. It's a limited Allied victory, but costs 150,000 Allied casualties to 130,000 German. Above the trenches, the First Air War has reached new levels of sophistication and deadliness. Reconnaissance aircraft are crucial for spotting enemy positions and directing artillery fire onto them. Scout aircraft or fighters try to shoot them down before they can execute their mission. New models of aircraft are
Pozdro.
developed every few months, but that spring, the superiority of German aircraft Allied losses in what becomes known as Bloody April.
Bloody.
Three days after the fall of Vimy Ridge, French General Robert Nivelle launches his main offensive. Expectations are high, but after initial success, the advance bogs down and casualties quickly mount.
Belkowają. No to są już dywizje jakieś. Kurcze bele.
The apparently senseless losses
America.
cause morale in the French army to collapse. Whole units
Fuck
mutiny,
yeah.
refusing to attack. General Nivelle is sacked as French commander-in-chief and replaced by General Pétain, hero of Verdun, who promises no more suicidal attacks. That summer, at Messines Ridge, the British tunnel under the German lines and detonate 19 enormous mines under the enemy position. It's the largest
Czy oni
man-made
zostawili
explosion
stolicę?
in history to date and paves the way to a brilliant
What?
but highly local British victory. In Greece, King Constantine, who has favoured neutrality, is forced to abdicate, and Greece joins the Allies. Russia's provisional government orders a new attack, but the July offensive is a disaster. The morale and discipline of the Russian army has collapsed. It can no longer be relied on to fight, and the Central Powers' counterattack is
Dobra.
almost unopposed.
Pędz.
At sea, the Allies begin to group their merchant ships into convoys, which sail under naval escort. The new system leads to a steady fall in losses. The tide is turning in the U-boat war. As discontent with the war grows in Germany, the German parliament, the Reichstag, passes a peace resolution, calling for a peace of understanding and reconciliation. It's ignored by the German High Command, which now
No I bęc.
effectively rules the country as a military dictatorship. In Belgium, the British launched their major offensive of 1917, the Third Battle of Ypres. It will be remembered as Passchendaele. Heavy shelling, rain and broken irrigation channels turned the battlefield into a sea of mud. In these impossible conditions, all hopes of a breakthrough soon fade. The attack is called off after 3 months, by which point the British have suffered 240,000 casualties, the Germans 200,000. On the Italian front, at the 11th Battle of the Isonzo, Italian and Austro-Hungarian forces battled each other to exhaustion. There are 150,000 Italian casualties, 100,000 Austro-Hungarian. That year, 1917, the list of allied nations grows. Brazil,
Trzeba może jakieś, albo
China,
mniejszało to.
all declare war on Germany as a
Jakieś
result
takie
of
najszybsze
German
dywizje ogarniemy.
or to curry favor with the allies.
Jakiś blitz.
China will contribute many thousands
Można by
of
się pobawić, no.
working for the allies in Europe, the Middle East and Asia. That year in the Middle East,
Do light tanka,
British
okej.
forces avenged their 1916 humiliation at Kut by defeating the Ottoman Turks and marching on to occupy Baghdad. British forces in Egypt advance across the Sinai Desert, but are thrown back by Ottoman forces at the First and Second Battles of Gaza. In July, Arab rebels capture the strategic Ottoman port of Aqaba. They are accompanied by a British military advisor, Captain T.E. Lawrence, better known as Lawrence of Arabia. That autumn, British Foreign Secretary
Nie,
Arthur
100% to jest
issues
zajebiście.
the Balfour Declaration, expressing support for the creation of a national home for the Jews in Palestine. The aim is to rally Jewish support for the Allies, but the declaration contradicts existing pledges to Arab leaders.
Jakiegoś blitzkriega.
In October, the British finally win at Gaza, clearing the way for an advance into Palestine. 6 weeks later, General Allenby leads British troops into Jerusalem, ending 400 years of Ottoman rule. With Russian forces in disarray, Germany is able to move troops from the east to the Italian front. At the Battle of Caporetto, they help to smash through the Italian army, advancing 70 miles and taking 250,000 prisoners. British and French divisions, desperately needed on the Western Front, have to be redeployed to shore up the line. In Russia, a second revolution brings Lenin's Bolshevik party to power. He is determined to end Russia's involvement in the war. In France, Georges Clemenceau becomes Prime Minister. Nicknamed the Tiger, he promises total war and total victory. But for the Allies in late 1917, final victory looks uncertain. Russia has stopped fighting. French armies are recovering from mutiny. The Italian front has almost collapsed, and American reinforcements still seem a long way off. For the time being, the British are the only effective Allied force in the field. So the British attack at Cambrai with the first major tank assault in history. On the first day, nearly 400 tanks spearhead an advance of several miles through German defences. But then the tanks break down or are knocked out. The Germans rush in reinforcements, and the gains are lost.
I co ja bym tu chciał?
Finland declares independence from Russia.
12 na godzinę.
Romania, isolated by the Russian collapse, signs an armistice with the Central
Obczajmy
Powers.
takie coś.
6 days later, Russia also signs an armistice. The Allied Eastern Front
4 dywizje.
is no more. 1917 has seen one major Allied power, Russia, knocked out of the war. But the arrival of a fresh new ally, America. Germany knows only military victory can now save it from being overwhelmed by Allied resources, and begins planning one last massive onslaught for the spring of 1918. After 3.5 years of war,
To można wziąć.
allies are in crisis.
Pozdro.
Russia has been rocked by
Jeszcze
revolution.
muszę ograć tutaj tę południową Amerykę, nie? Trzeba czwartą Rzeszę stworzyć. Senior Hitlerem. To jest w Argentynie chyba. O Jezus Maria. Jezusiku kochany. Gdzie to jest? Może to jest całkiem... Chociaż nie wiem, czy nie zmieniali coś? To jest... A to jest armia, okej. Dominate this,
Germany faces inevitable defeat unless it can win a quick victory on the Western Front. US President Wilson announces his 14 points. They
Juan
outline his
Jose.
vision for a post-war world, including
Grupo
an
de
end to
Oficiales
secret
Unidos.
treaties, a reduction in the size
Polish
of armed
Workers
forces,
Party. PPS.
self-determination for
Whoa.
the people of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and an international organization to settle future disputes. But most European leaders dismiss his ideas as wishful thinking.
Jeszcze British Radzem można było garnąć.
At Brest-Litovsk, Bolshevik Russia
British.
signs a peace treaty with the Central Powers. Russia gives up vast amounts of territory in exchange for peace. 500,000 German troops can now be redeployed from the east to the Western Front, where German General Erich Ludendorff plans an all-out, last-ditch offensive to win the war.
Pozdro.
Ludendorff's
Siamese
spring
People's
offensive
Republic.
catches the Allies off
What?
guard. German stormtroopers
To jest jakieś
using
ludzkie,
new
o.
infiltration tactics help to overwhelm the
Oho.
British Fifth Army, which is soon in full retreat.
Irek.
The German advance threatens to split the British and French armies, with disastrous consequences. So French General Ferdinand Foch is appointed Supreme Commander of Allied Forces to coordinate
O
strategy.
Jezus.
Outside
Troszkę nam
Amiens,
zleci tego
British
czasu.
and Australian
A jeszcze... O
troops
Jezus.
improvise a defense. And finally
Trzeba
halt
będzie
the
zmienić,
German
bo
advance.
przecież... Czekajcie, equipment.
The German offensive switches to the north, targeting the Channel ports. But the British inflict heavy losses on the Germans and prevent a breakthrough. Above the trenches, the first air war continues to escalate.
Nie no, kurwa.
Each
Co ja
side
narobiłem?
now has more than 3,000 aircraft in service on the Western Front. But by 1918, the Allies have won air superiority, thanks to greater resources. On the 21st of April, Germany's most famous pilot, Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, is shot down and killed near Amiens. With 80 victories, he's the war's highest-scoring ace, and is buried by the Allies with full military honours. Britain's new independent bombing force launches a daylight raid against Cologne. It marks the beginning of Britain's own strategic bombing campaign. On the ground, Ludendorff's offensive switches south, targeting the French. German troops advance 30 miles, but are halted at the River Marne, just as fresh American divisions enter the line. The US 1st Division is the first to see
5
combat.
dziennie się
The
robi.
Battle of
Oho.
Cantigny.
No to zajebiście.
US 2nd Division wins victory at the Battle of Belleau Wood. By now, there are nearly 1 million American soldiers in France, with 10,000 more arriving every day. The fourth phase of the German offensive leads to a 9-mile advance, but is finally halted by a French counterattack. In Italy, Austria-Hungary launches an attack at Asiago and the Piave River to support Ludendorff's offensive in France. But it's repulsed with heavy losses and morale amongst
23
the
dziennie się będą
Austro-Hungarian
robić.
army
No 30 dziennie, okej.
British and French troops land at Murmansk in northern Russia. It's the beginning of Allied intervention in Russia's civil war, on the side of so-called white or anti-Bolshevik forces. On the Western Front, the Germans' final attack is defeated in the Second Battle of the Marne. Ludendorff's offensive has cost the Germans more than 600,000 casualties and has failed to make a decisive breakthrough. Germany's final gamble has failed.
Niech robią te gesy, śmegesy.
The Allies now go on the attack. At the Battle of Amiens, British, Australian, Canadian and French troops, supported by tanks and aircraft, advance 7 miles in a single day. General Ludendorff calls the 8th of August the Black Day of the German army. German troops are exhausted, hungry and demoralized, and begin to surrender in their thousands. The Battle of Amiens begins the Allies' 100 Days Offensive.
What?
French warfare is over. The Germans are in full retreat.
Oni dostają jakieś czołgi? Bo widzę, że nie za bardzo.
In the Balkans, a new Allied offensive at Dobropolje breaks through Bulgarian positions. The overstretched Bulgarian
Czekajcie, chyba to
army
trzeba będzie
collapses,
wyłączyć
and
w
2
ogóle.
weeks later, Bulgaria signs an armistice.
To już im
In the
niepotrzebne.
Middle East, British-led forces defeat the Turks at the Battle of Megiddo, taking 25,000 prisoners. Allied troops soon occupy Damascus and Aleppo. On the Western Front, Marshal Foch orders a general attack. British, French,
Dobra, bo to mieli na średnim medium equipment priority,
a
dlatego
line
im
of
tak
reinforced German defenses.
nie przychodziły te wszystkie te gesy, śmegesy.
Ludendorff informs the Kaiser that the military situation is hopeless and that Germany must seek an armistice. Germany sends a request to US President Woodrow Wilson, who in return demands German withdrawal from all occupied territory and the Kaiser's abdication.
Beep, 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 beep.
On the Italian front, the Allies deliver the final blow to
Ty możemy ich
Austria-Hungary
jeszcze podzielić,
at the
ja
Battle of
pierdzielę.
Vittorio Veneto.
I oni będą mieć zajebiste.
The Austro-Hungarian army disintegrates and 300,000 prisoners are taken. With the Central Powers facing
Wow.
collapse, the Ottoman
Operation
Empire
Haller
signs an armistice with the
isn't
Allies in
veterans.
Woodruff. 4 days
Oj,
later,
nie, może.
Austria-Hungary signs
Czad.
an armistice with the Allies at Villa Giusti. At Kiel, the German High Seas Fleet is ordered to make a suicidal attack on the British Navy. but instead it mutinies.
Kurwa no.
Revolution spreads through
Pozdro.
the Kaiser abdicates. And a
Ta, można sobie tu ich fajnie podzielić, że ta, można się w to bawić. To tamto. W poniedziałek sobie trochę poćwiczyłem i zakwasy mam do dzisiaj. Może jutro już będę się normalnie czuł, bo kurwa dzisiaj, wczoraj to ledwo chodziłem.
American private Henry Gunter is killed, charging a German machine gun at 10:59. He is thought to be the last soldier killed during World War I. 3 days later, in East Africa, German General von Lettow-Vorbeck surrenders his army on the Chambezi River. For 4 years, he has tied down huge numbers of Allied troops, remaining undefeated while cut off from home. He is still considered one of history's greatest guerrilla leaders.
Guerrilla?
The Paris Peace Conference opens at the Palace of Versailles, just outside the French.
Jeszcze 1400 na 30. To jest miesiąc, tak? Dobrze liczę, bo 30 razy 40 dni. To będzie 1200, no, z minus. 40 parę dni jeszcze. Miesiąc. Półtorej. Teraz, tak, zaraz będę ich mógł wystawić.
Germany must also accept responsibility for the war in a war guilt clause, a source of lasting resentment in Germany.
Orpę orzeł.
The boundaries of Europe are redrawn. Poland re-emerges after 100 years of foreign rule, while Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and an enlarged Romania emerge from the ashes of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Ottoman Empire is dismantled. New states, most under European control, are created in the Middle East. Here, as in Europe, the seeds of future conflict are sown. While in the Far East, former German possessions in China are handed to Japan, to China's outrage. World War I claimed the lives of 9.5 million
Dobra, trzeba
soldiers.
będzie ich podzielić, to są closer support. Są kasy.
21 million more
To jest
wounded.
transport.
7 million civilians also lost their lives. Huge areas of Europe were
Kurwa no.
devastated. Old
To są
empires
groups, tak?
vanished. New states were born. Lives across the world were transformed. The world was never the
Naval.
same again.
To jest fight.
If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like it and subscribe to the channel. And find out
Czekajcie,
how you
trzeba
can help us
zmienić.
make more videos at our Patreon page. 532 AD.
Pozdro!
Constantinople, the greatest city in the world, is in flames. But this is no barbarian attack. Citizens of the Eastern Roman Empire are rioting, murdering state officials and setting buildings on fire. Trapped inside his own palace, Emperor Justinian fears
niech
his
będzie
reign
i tak.
is over. He's already given in to the mob's demands and sacked his most hated officials. But now the crowds acclaim a new emperor, Hypatius. It's his wife, Empress Theodora, who'll give him the courage to act, and his most trusted general, Belisarius, to whom he'll turn to crush his enemies and save the regime.
Reżim.
Centuries of imperial crisis, Justinian's reign will witness a Roman fightback that few had dreamed possible. Great victories over the barbarians, the reconquest of Rome itself, the reunification of the empire.
Gotujemy się do wojny.
Belisarius is the commander who will lead this onslaught. He will be remembered as Rome's
Dokładnie.
last great general.
Maja, Maja. Ama Kumbameya.
AD. It's more than 50 years since the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Rome itself, the eternal city, is now part of an Ostrogothic kingdom of Italy. But though Rome may have fallen, the empire endures. The Eastern Roman Empire remains a force to be reckoned with. An estimated 30 million people live under the rule of the emperor in Constantinople. His authority stretches from the ravaged Balkans to the imperial breadbasket, Egypt, the Arabian desert to the mountains of Armenia. This Christian empire remains unrivaled in administrative sophistication, economic power, and military might. But the new emperor, Justinian, faces formidable challenges. In 527, he succeeds Justin, his uncle and adopted father, becoming the first son to succeed his father as emperor in more than a century. Justinian is from a tough peasant background in Illyricum, what's now North Macedonia. He's highly educated, restless and driven, and sets himself two ambitious goals. First, to restore harmony in the Christian church by ending the schism between Chalcedonian or Orthodox Christians and Miaphysites,
Pozdro.
who argue over Christ's
Dragable.
divine nature.
Fucking drug.
Second, to reform and rationalize Roman law, the divinely sanctioned institution that distinguishes the Roman world from the barbarian. The imperial majesty should not only be adorned with arms, but also be armed with laws, so that there may be good government in
Kurde,
times both of
klikam
war
po tym.
and peace, he later declares.
Ajajaj.
But as for any Roman emperor, the ultimate test of his legitimacy will come in war. For now, Justinian has good relations with the Vandals in North Africa and the Ostrogoths in Italy. The Balkan frontier requires constant vigilance. The successors to Attila's
Te
Han
bombowce trzeba
Empire are
wypierdzielić,
never
bo one
quiet for
są
long.
bez sensu.
But it's in the east that Justinian faces his most immediate challenge. The Persian Sassanid Empire, a rival superpower of the Middle East. This frontier has been a battleground for centuries and witnessed its share of Roman defeats, including one emperor captured, another killed. For most of the last century, the shared menace of the Huns led to a wary coexistence. But it could not last. In 525, the Christian king of Iberia in the Caucasus appealed to the Romans for aid when the Persian king Kavad tried to impose Zoroastrian rituals on his country. The Romans send military aid, and the conflict escalates, with both sides launching cross-border raids. When the Romans begin building a new fort at Minduos, the Persians attack, rout the Roman troops, and destroy the building works. One of the Roman generals to escape this debacle is Flavius
Torpedo.
Belisarius. Clearly he is not blamed,
Torpedo.
because the next year Justinian makes him commander of all Roman troops in the east, though he's barely 30 years old. Belisarius and the emperor are old comrades, and come from similar rural backgrounds in the Balkans. His wife Antonina is the best friend of Empress Theodora, and like her from a low-born background, the daughter of an actress. With both Roman and Persian empires
60 dni,
mobilizing
wow!
for the next year, 530, will see Belisarius's first major test as a commander.
The troops that Belisarius commands are far removed from the famous legions with which Rome conquered its empire centuries ago. Hard lessons learned from fighting Huns and Persians have helped to forge a new Roman army. For centuries, cavalry was the neglected arm of the Roman military, a role usually outsourced to foreign auxiliaries. Now, heavy armoured cavalry known as clibanarii and cataphracti, armed with lance and sword, form the army's elite shock units. Some armoured cavalry, as well as cursores, light cavalry, also carry bows. The Romans, in imitation of the Huns and Persians, are now horse archers themselves. The best units are the bucellari, the biscuit eaters, named after the army ration.
Co oni odstawiają? Czy oni są normalni?
Personal regiment. Long service, good pay and equipment, plus a personal oath of loyalty make them his most reliable troops.
Bestia?
Roman archers are now armed with the more powerful composite reflex bows of the Huns. And while infantry still made up around 2/3 of a Roman army, its role is more defensive, forming a secure base from which the cavalry could launch its attacks. The standard infantry unit is also smaller, called a numerus in Latin, arithmos in Greek, about regimental size, from 1,000 to 1,500 men. They're more mixed, with armoured veterans to form a fulcrum or shield wall, and more missile troops behind them to unleash a barrage of arrows, javelins and darts. Finally, Rome boosts its military strength by recruiting the very barbarians it had once despised, including Huns, Goths and Heruli. Those outside the empire are recruited as mercenaries. Those within serve as foederati, federates, and are usually commanded by their own officers. The military organization of the empire has also been overhauled. Two central field armies stationed on either side of the Bosphorus are commanded by a magister militum presentalis and form a strategic reserve. Field armies based in Thrace, Illyria, Armenia and the east are each commanded by a magister militum and form regional rapid reaction forces. The frontiers are held by the limitani. These are the lowest paid and least well equipped troops, only expected to hold their fortified outposts until reinforcements arrive. Limitani are organized into local groups, each commanded by a dux, origin of our word, duke. Yet the thought has many times occurred to me,
Political
how
commissars.
great are the benefits which accrue to states through history, which transmits to future generations the memory of those who have gone before, and resists the steady effort of time to bury events in oblivion. The historian Procopius is our key witness for the events of this period. He was born around 500 in the city of Caesarea in Palestine and received a first-class education. In 527, he was appointed assessor or legal advisor to Belisarius. He effectively became the general's secretary and, on occasion, aide-de-camp. Working from notes and writing in Greek, he would publish his great work, History of the Wars, in 551. Procopius's account is highly favorable to Belisarius, but there will be a sting in the tale, a scandalous secret history which will emerge later in the tale. 530 AD. King Kavad sends an army to capture the Roman frontier fortress at Dara. Today, the ruins of Dara lie on the Turkish-Syrian border, their scale hinting at the size of the Roman fortress that once stood here. Belisarius is warned that 40,000 Persian troops are advancing on Dara. He can only assemble 25,000 troops to meet them. For reasons that are unclear, Belisarius decides to make his stand outside the city walls to the south. His men dig ditches to strengthen their position, with both flanks thrown forward. The infantry is placed in the center, with cavalry on both flanks. 2 groups of 600 Hun mercenaries are positioned between them in support. At the rear, he places his reserve, his own Bukalari. When the huge Persian army
O
arrives
Jezus,
before
kurczę.
Dara, Belisarius is ready and waiting. The first day begins with a standoff. The 2 generals exchange letters. Belisarius urges Firuz to withdraw to allow time for further negotiations. Firuz tells the Roman to prepare his bath. He intends to be in Dara by nightfall.
Dobra, tak powinno starczyć.
Roman left wing. Perhaps the Persians are driven off, with 7 killed.
Torczyk.
When a young
XD.
Persian warrior rides between the lines and challenges any Roman to face him in single combat, his offer is accepted by Andreas. Andreas has no military training, but he's a wrestling instructor of huge strength. Before the Persian knows what's happening, Andreas has knocked him off his horse with his lance, then dismounts to finish him off, like a sacrificial animal, in the words of Procopius. Andreas later kills a second Persian challenger, to Roman cheers and the dismay of the Persians. The next morning, Firuz receives 10,000 reinforcements.
Dobra, ja. Ciekawe, czy ich przetniemy, tak jak myślę.
50,000. With odds of 2 to 1 in his favor, he decides to attack.
Tybet. Oj, oj, oj.
Firuz forms up his army with
Pamiętam, że było z tym,
archers in the
z
center,
Richardem Girem.
and his Persian
Bo
heavy
Richard Gere był
cavalry
takim, no,
Zavaran on both wings.
bardzo kultowy, że
He also
ludzie tak go...
divides his army into 2 parts, a frontal
No, każdy go
and a
lubił i on był
reserve,
taki rozchwytywany.
so that fresh troops
I ogólnie
could be
był
rotated
problem...
into the fighting. He keeps
Oni mają problem
forces
z Tajwanem, Chińczycy,
Persian heavy
i z
cavalry
Tybetem, bo oni
as his
tak...
personal reserve.
Jest taki sam problem, kurwa się nie mogę wysłowić, jak z Rosją i Ukrainą, nie? Że Rosja sobie upatrzyła jakiś tam casus belli tak zwane, jakieś roszczenia terytorialne ma co do Ukrainy. Tak samo jest z Chinami, Tybetem i Tajwanem, nie?
Persia is famed for the skill of its archers, but today the wind favors the Romans. When the archers run out of arrows,
Asia Alliance?
Persian cavalry begins its advance. This is the moment Belisarius has prepared for. The Savaran crash into his left wing.
Mamy 1000, ja nie mogę. Ale planning bonus dużo daje. Już 4 praktycznie. No i po sprawie. Patrz, i teraz mamy ich tak. Pania Luka. Wy do Belgradu jedź ta.
Firuz switches to the other flank, attacking with his heavy cavalry, supported by the elite immortals. The Roman cavalry breaks under the pressure, streaming
Under
back to
the
walls
fucking
of Dara.
pressure. Dobra, jak najwięcej trzeba będzie, myślę, tych, no.
He recalls the Huns that are pursuing the Persian right wing and launches both Hun groups, as well as his own Bukalari, against the flank
Bukalari.
and rear of the Persian attack. It's the decisive moment of the battle. The Persian left wing
83 żeśmy
finds itself
stracili.
under attack from 3 sides. Those that can't escape are
To jest problem z zaopatrzeniem, tak, ale to...
Sunikas, one of the Hun captains, kills a Persian standard bearer. Then General Barsham himself, who commands the Persian left wing. With the elite units of the Persian army in
Pristina,
fight, the
to.
infantry offers little resistance. Most are peasant conscripts, no match for Roman
O, 12 na ten.
Soon the
To
entire
można by
Persian
coś
army
ogarnąć. Division
is in
Defense.
battle.
Supply Consumption, żeby byli jak najszybsi.
And unwilling to risk any last-minute reverse, halts the pursuit. Procopius tells us 8,000 Persians lay dead on the battlefield, a number that could be accurate. For on that day, the Persians had been defeated in battle by the Romans, a thing which had not happened for a long time.
Oho.
Belisarius has won a brilliant victory for the Empire. Later that year, Suba, Magister Militum of Armenia, wins another victory over the Persians at Satala. The war is swinging in Rome's favor.
Bien.
But the following year,
Come on, brah.
encouraged by a Samaritan revolt in Palestine, King Kavad
Come on,
orders a
brah.
large-scale raid along the Euphrates.
Zapominam o tych agencjach pieprzonych.
Belisarius assembles an army
Ajajaj.
to meet them. But having ravaged Roman territory, the Persians are content to withdraw with their loot. Belisarius shadows them. His subordinates urge him to destroy the enemy before they escape. So, against his better judgment, he attacks the Persians the day before Easter Sunday at Kalinikum.
A to można ich podzielić. A, rozumiem, bo są te kory, nie?
Rome's arrow
No Montenegro, a możemy po prostu to wybrać.
hold the right flank.
Dobra, czaję bazę.
Procopius accuses them of fleeing
Czaję
at the
bombę.
first sign of danger.
Tak, bo możemy wziąć kory i... Okej, czaję.
Persian cavalry rolls up the entire Roman
Ja
line.
poнимаю już, poнимаю.
In desperation, the Roman infantry form a shield wall with their backs to the river. They hold
Backs
off
to
the
the
enemy
river.
cavalry, buying time for the
No i
remains
tak
of the
szczerze
army
byśmy się
to
ponapierdalali
escape
z
across
kimś,
the
nie?
river. Kalinikum is a humiliation for Rome and for Belisarius. His own role in the battle is unclear. According to Procopius, he remained with the infantry, organizing
No.
the retreat. Another source claims he was among the first to flee. It had clearly been a serious blunder to
Ja bym
give in to
przerzucił
pressure
teraz,
from subordinates to fight an unnecessary
Tutaj do Norwegii, no, tak będzie najlepiej.
Belisarius is removed from command and recalled to Constantinople. Justinian is forced to pay a subsidy and make a compromise peace with Persia. Not with King Kavad,
No.
who dies that year, but with his 20-year-old son, Khosrow. Khosrow will prove to be the greatest of all Sasanian kings, hailed as Anushirvan, the immortal soul,
Mortal
and will
Soul.
prove a dangerous rival to the Romans. When major rioting breaks out in Constantinople the next year, Belisarius is in the capital, eager to restore his tarnished reputation. The riots have been instigated by the factions of the Hippodrome, the Greens and Blues. These are more than chariot racing fans. The factions run whole areas of the city. At first they seek only the release of
Ale
jailed
go idę tam,
convicts,
ja pierdolę.
but then there are calls
Ja
for a new
pierdolstein.
emperor, Hypatius, nephew of Emperor Anastasius. It's likely that Justinian's rivals in the Senate are now pulling the strings.
Senate.
Justinian hesitates. He wonders if
W imieniu
he should
Polski
flee the
podziemnej.
capital. Then Theodora speaks up. Life as a fugitive, she declares, would be unendurable. Better the old saying, royal purple makes a noble shroud. In other words, better to go down fighting. The emperor is emboldened by Theodora's words and orders Belisarius and another general, Mundus, to crush the revolt. Belisarius's hardened troops launch a sudden attack on the rioters. There is no mercy. The streets run with blood. The final death toll
Rapid
is
fire
estimated at
guns. I co?
30,000, a staggering 1 in 20 of the city's population. The next day, Justinian orders the execution of Hypatius and his brother, probably innocent pawns in somebody else's plot. Their bodies are tossed into the sea. Thanks to Theodora and Belisarius, Justinian's
Pozdro.
throne is safe for now. A Roman emperor relied on one quality more than any other from his loyalty. Belisarius
Poverty.
beyond beyond doubt.
Beyond doubt.
Justinian needs to shore up support for his regime, assert his legitimacy and God's favor with a military victory. He has his costly peace with the Sassanid Empire, so he will turn west. A war to reclaim Rome's lost provinces from the barbarians will be a service to God and Justinian. Such a mission can be entrusted to only one man, Belisarius. When the Western Roman Empire was overrun by barbarians in the 5th century, the Vandals emerged as perhaps the most enterprising of Rome's enemies. From Central Europe, they marched, killed and looted their way through Roman territory into Spain, and in 429 crossed into North Africa under the leadership of King Geseric. There he founded a kingdom and took up piracy with skill and enthusiasm.
Pozdro.
405, Geseric sacked Rome itself. 75 years later, Eastern Romans and Vandals had learned to tolerate each other. Emperor Justinian's relations with the Vandal king Hilderic were in fact extremely cordial. The two men exchanged gifts, and though Justinian regretted that Hilderic was an Arian heretic, he was pleased that he did at least allow Orthodox Christians in his realm to live in peace. Then, in 530 AD, there was a coup in the kingdom of the Vandals. Gelimer, Hilderic's cousin and heir, seized power and imprisoned the ex-king. Unlike his hapless predecessor, humiliated in war by the Berber tribes, Gelimer was a proven warrior, and cunning to boot. When Justinian scolded Gelimer as a usurper, the new Vandal king warned the emperor to mind his own affairs, then, for good measure, blinded one of Hilderic's nephews. 3 years pass. Justinian makes peace with the Sassanid Empire and survives the...
Dobra, zaczynamy trzecią wojnę światową,
Now
może
he
ja tu będę.
decides it's time to teach Gelimer a lesson. Imperial propaganda and the historian Procopius will later portray Justinian's war on the Vandals as part of a long-held plan to reconquer the Western Empire, for the sake of true belief in God and the liberty of our subjects. Modern historians are more skeptical. Justinian needs a victory to bolster his regime. Gelimer's actions have provided just provocation, and the recovery of North Africa's wealthy estates will bring obvious benefits. Perhaps self-interest, opportunism, and a sense of divine imperial mission all play a part in his decision to go to war. Many try to dissuade the emperor. His senior advisor, John of Cappadocia, warns of the hazards and cost of a long-range seaborne operation. His generals are haunted by the fate of the last Roman expedition to North Africa, a huge fleet destroyed by Vandal fireships off Cape Bon. Justinian is not deterred. He orders the fleet and army to assemble at Constantinople. Belisarius, restored to the rank of Magister Militum per Orientem, General of the East, is given complete authority over the campaign. His force includes 10,000 infantry under the command of John of Dyrrachium, 5,000 cavalry divided between Federati and regular Roman units, as well as 600 Hun mercenaries, 400 Heruli mercenaries, and Belisarius' own Bucellari, probably around 1,000 men. An old comrade, John of Armenia, will be his second in command. Solomon, a eunuch, his chief staff officer. It is not a large army, but most are hardened veterans from the wars in the East. Belisarius will also be accompanied by his wife, Antonina, an arrangement that doubtless provokes comments from conservative Romans, but seems to have been generally accepted. She will prove an insightful and effective ally to her husband, as well as a valuable agent to her patron and friend, Empress Theodora. The fleet sets sail
Jezus Maria,
in
zaraz.
June 533.
Kariera.
Belisarius believes that much will depend on the discipline of his men. But before they've even cleared the Hellespont, two unmercenaries drunkenly murder a comrade.
Commonwealth of Philippines.
Belisarius has them hanged in full view of the fleet. Then he addresses the army. If I were speaking to men going to war for the first time, I might struggle to persuade you that justice can be our greatest ally in obtaining victory. For those who don't understand the fortunes of war, think the outcome depends on strength alone. But you, I think, know that although it's men who do the fighting, it is God who judges the contest. This is why Belisarius warns them he will never turn a blind eye to their crimes. He concludes, I shall not consider any one of you my comrade, no matter how fearsome he is to the enemy, unless his hands are clean. The fleet continues its voyage, making stops to pick up supplies and additional troops. Along the way, 500 men die from eating moldy bread, which Procopius blames on cost-cutting measures by the stingy John of Cappadocia. In Sicily, Belisarius receives fresh supplies from the Goths. There, as he ponders his next move, he receives stunning news. Not only are the Vandals completely unaware of his expedition, but Gelimer has sent his brother Zazo with most of the Vandal fleet and 5,000 troops to quell a revolt in
Dobra,
Sardinia.
czekajcie, zaraz przyjdę.
Belisarius might have been tempted to land in Tripolitania, where Romanized locals are already in revolt against the Vandals. But reassured by the absence of the Vandal fleet, he decides to land in the Vandal heartland, within striking distance of their capital, Carthage. The landing is unopposed, but Belisarius is furious when some of his men steal from the locals. He has them punished, then speaks once more to the troops. The Libyans, being Romans from of old, are unfaithful and hostile to the Vandals. Now your lack of self-control has made the opposite true. He warns them that lawlessness will lose them the support of the people and lead only to defeat and death. But with good behavior, you will have God on your side. The Libyan people will support you, and the Vandals will be at your mercy. Belisarius orders some of his most trusted men to infiltrate a nearby town, Selectum, to see if the people will come over to the Roman side. The soldiers enter discreetly at dawn. They inform local elders that Belisarius has come to overthrow Gelimer the usurper and restore their freedom. The townsmen agree to let the army into the city and open the market to them. Belisarius is gracious and generous to the Libyans. Crucially, his men behave well. They pay for supplies and win the trust of the locals. Procopius, an eyewitness, records that from henceforth, the campaign is like moving through their own country. Belisarius begins his advance along the coastal road to Carthage. He knows Gelimer is somewhere inland and could strike from almost any direction. So he orders John of Armenia, his second in command, to take 300 bucellari and scout 2 miles ahead of the main army. Belisarius himself commands a strong rear guard. The Huns are posted as a flank guard, 2 miles inland. Their sea flank is protected by the fleet, keeping pace with the army's advance. The army marches about 10 miles each day, then fortifies a camp at night. When Gelimer receives news of the Roman landing, he sends a message to his brother Amatus in Carthage. First, he is to execute Hilderic and the other prisoners. Then he is to gather all his men and join Gelimer at Addecimum, where they will ambush and destroy Belisarius's army. Addecimum, 10 miles south of Carthage. Here the coastal road passes through a narrow gap between a salt marsh and the sea. Gelimer knows Belisarius will have to pass this way, and that the headland of Cape Bon will separate him from his fleet. Amatus is to hold the road to Carthage, and when the Romans are fully engaged, Gelimer and his nephew Gibamund will fall on their flank and rear. Belisarius and his army approach. Roman patrols report skirmishes with the Vandals. Gelimer is close.
Ojejku.
A few miles
Trzeba w cholerę gumy, no ale ja będę musiał kurczę
Belisarius
kończyć.
gives the order to make camp.
Muszę do
He
sklepu
sends
jechać.
John's vanguard ahead to scout the road. At Addecimum,
Cholera
they
gumy, no
find
tak,
Amatus
tylko mogę sobie
with just a
stworzyć tę
handful
gumę.
of troops. He has arrived too early.
Czas
The rest
stworzyć
of
ją.
his men are still strung out on the road to Carthage. John and the Bucellari charge. Amatus fights bravely, killing 12 men before he is cut down. The Vandals' survivors flee back towards Carthage, with John and his men in pursuit. Groups of Vandals coming up the road see the fleeing horsemen. They think the
3000, a
whole
to co?
Roman army must be
Z
headed
innymi
their way.
fighters są.
They panic and join the rout. John and his men slay all the Vandals they can catch. Meanwhile, on the edge of the Salt Lake, the Huns have encountered Gibamund's column.
20% mamy szansy.
A single warrior rides forward to meet the enemy. This is the first time Gibamund and his men have faced Huns, but they know their fearsome reputation. They are unnerved by the lone horseman and suspect a trap. When the Huns charge, the Vandals quickly turn and flee. Gibamund is one of those killed in the rout. Gelimer is advancing between low hills that block his view of both Belisarius's camp and the fate of Gibamund.
Gallipoli.
Belisarius is also unaware that battle has been joined, but sends his Federati cavalry forward, expecting some skirmishing with the Vandals. When his cavalry
Chorus.
reach Addecimum, they see signs of fighting and bodies. Then, several thousand Vandal horsemen appear behind them. The Federati commanders have no idea whether to advance or retreat. After a brief clash, the entire force retreats back towards the
Naval
Roman camp.
invasion.
Gelimer is now in position to deal Belisarius a serious blow.
Pozdro.
If he heads north, he can trap and destroy John's isolated vanguard. If he moves south, he can hit the Roman cavalry while it's still confused and disordered. Instead,
Takimi krajami, no praktycznie z wszystkimi krajami, no. Kim się da. No poza oczywiście naszym blokiem.
As their king oversees his brother's burial, his perplexed troops look on and do nothing. Belisarius is given a crucial breathing space. He rallies his cavalry, reorganizes them, and leads them forward. The Roman cavalry fall on the Vandals with devastating force. The enemy are scattered. Gelimer and the survivors fly west.
Rzucają mi zaopatrzenie nawet, wow.
Carthage is open.
Ciekawe.
And it fell to Belisarius that day to win more fame than any other man of his time, or indeed any of the men of olden times.
Jak pokaż wroga niemieckiego, to żyjemy naszym Niemcom, ta.
Waits till dawn the next day
Taki mam zamiar.
before making his triumphal entry into Carthage.
Jedna dywizja przepchała chyba z 30, to jest coś pięknego.
The citizens of Carthage are respected. This peaceful occupation of such a wealthy city in such times
Jezus.
is remarkable.
Oni już
Belisarius sits
500
on
tysięcy,
Gelimer's
pół
throne
miliona
and
stracili.
eats the lunch that had been prepared for him. He attends to the requests and pleas of local citizens.
700 tysięcy.
Aren't beaten yet.
Pierdalamy od Trondka im.
intended for Gelimer, that Zazo has put down the Sardinian revolt and is returning with 5,000 men. Reinforced, Gelimer advances on Carthage. Belisarius leads out his army to face him at Tricamarum. The Roman cavalry camps near a small brook, where the Vandals catch them off guard.
Żeby można samoloty ogarnąć, ale samoloty to ogarnę na ten. Na Niemcy tutaj.
But again, Gelimer fails to exploit an advantage. He does nothing as the Romans deploy.
Indian
Their
Bomber.
infantry, which had fallen behind on the march from Carthage, gets into position. It's the Romans who attack first, when John of Armenia leads the Bucellari forward against the Vandal center. Twice he is repulsed, but the third attack is made with greater force. Zazo himself is killed within sight of Gelimer. Belisarius orders the rest of his army forward. The Vandals flee, leaving behind 800 dead. The Romans have lost just 50 men. The Vandals take refuge in their camp, which contains all their baggage and their families. But when Belisarius brings up his infantry to begin the assault, King Gelimer flees. The fight is entirely one-sided. Panic
Pozdro.
engulfs the Vandal camp as everyone tries to escape. The Romans kill the men, enslave the women and children, and plunder all they can find. Belisarius cannot restore discipline until the morning. Gelimer
Jeszcze go złapali.
towards the mountains.
No w ogóle ci
Belisarius sends John in pursuit with
Włochy, ale ogólnie to
5 days later, John is accidentally killed.
ci szpiegowie to są troszkę bez sensu, no. Tak.
Belisarius grieves.
Znaczy za dużo trzeba inwestować w to i takie kupsko się robi trochę.
The Vandal king takes refuge with the Berber tribes. 3 months later, hunger and the promise of comfort and clemency persuades him to surrender. Meanwhile, Belisarius sends one of his officers to Sardinia with the head of the king's brother Zazo. The island quickly submits to Roman rule, as too does Corsica. From Carthage, detachments and emissaries travel east and west as North Africa rejoins the Roman Empire.
Commando.
Settlements and outposts still suffer Berber raids, but Belisarius delegates this war to his able staff officer Solomon. He sails for Constantinople with his prisoners and a vast quantity of loot. He has learned that a small group of officers, motivated by envy and ambition, have told the emperor that Belisarius plans to found his own kingdom in North Africa. Belisarius soon persuades
Dobra.
Justinian in person that this is
Będę kończył. No jutro się skończymy, myślę. Znaczy jutro będzie kolejna część, nie wiem czy skończymy. Może jutro, może pojutrze. Trzymajcie się.